A very good morning to you. Good morning to your viewers. Look, I think the testimonies paint a very interesting picture that speaks to us about the complexities of managing your state-owned enterprises, especially when you take into consideration the testimony by Lynne Brown, the testimony by Gwede Mantashe, the testimony by Mr. Makwetla. But somewhere in between, the issue of political interference seems somewhat to paint a dark picture in the political history of our country, where state resources were usurped to advance personal interests. Manipulation was very evident. And to some degree, the issue of putting in place persons who, by and large, did not know what they are doing and what their purpose was, except, of course, to advance serious allegations of corruption, sadly, mismanagement of state resources, which I've alluded to, and, of course, in the end, putting the well-being of beneficiaries at risk. This is unfortunate, but then it tells a story of a kind in our history.
Now, Lynne Brown spoke about the fact that she knew there was corruption going on. She knew there was corruption before her term, and that corruption is still happening, and that there's absolutely nothing that she thinks or anybody can do about it.
Well, there were attempts, although it's turning out to be somewhat of futile attempts. The establishment of the war room, for instance, which I suspect would be one particular angle that may be thrown at the president as and when he appears for his own testimony in the commission. And it will be interesting to see what kind of response would come from him to either justify or give an account of sorts as to whether the whole idea was conceived well, and of course the results thereof were appreciated. I suspect going forward, one needs to also reflect on the role of state institutions supportive of our democracy. For instance, the role of the Auditor General in flagging out some of these corrupt transactions. Less so, unfortunately, on the part of the NPA, a little bit on the part of the Hawks in terms of investigations, but the picture doesn't look good. And we wait further testimonies that may very well paint a further bad picture as we listen to more testimonies.
Well, Prof, I'd like to bring you back to Lynne Brown and something else that she said. She said there are about 720 SEOs, and many of these government is not aware of their existence, she said. And that almost suggests that the reason that they're hidden, for want of a better description, is to further these corruption allegations.
Added to that, it's the question of readiness to take charge of the entire public service, to take charge of the entire public sector. And I'm differentiating the two to strongly suggest that it is easy to run your public institutions from an executive point of view, but difficult if you have inherited a system wherein government business became the order of the day. Where so, without having conducted proper institutional survey to determine which state-run business is doing what, who's heading that, and to what degree are these institutions enjoying government support, which, by the way, it is at the behest of the taxpayers' money. So all these issues tells us that public service, public sector in this country has somewhat been neglected, has somewhat been taken over by administrations that, in a sense, hijacked the system without necessarily doing due diligence to the process of institutional survey and, of course, determining the rationality behind the establishment of the same.
So is it fair to suggest then that if there are all these other SEOs that government is not aware of, that the corruption that we are seeing, certainly around Eskom, Bosasa and so on, is only a tip of the iceberg?
I suspect so. I'm happy that when you follow the Commission's testimonies, you begin to appreciate the pattern of evidence that's being presented. Sadly, this pattern highlights, reflects inefficiencies, corruption, maladministration, something that has been highlighted in research literature as nothing short of the so-called evil administration. Sadly, South Africa is a testimony to that. At a time when we could have taken lessons from post-colonial Africa on how to avoid these pitfalls and make sure that we have a very well-oiled machine when it comes to issues of public service, when it comes to issues of the public sector as such.
And I suppose your last comments around Gwede Mantashe, he accepted three installations from Bosasa. He knew Gavon, the former CEO of Bosasa, Gavon Watson, from a time, obviously, and he said he knew that he was a corrupt individual, but he still accepted installations from this institution.
Yeah, that's sad. At a time when we want to inculcate very strong ethical influence into government. We're sitting here at a time when we have energy crisis, and then suddenly an energy minister comes out to say, look, I may have slipped in terms of my very own public conduct, which in turn contravenes what Mr. Makwetla was saying yesterday, to say, I challenged some of these issues, but then in the end, I became a victim of a parliamentary process which found me guilty, and I'm still challenging it. I'm still challenging it now. But somewhat a different account from Mr. Mantashe, who by own admission would say, look, I accepted this and life went on as normal. But from a public ethic point of view, these are serious issues, and one would suspect that further questions will have to be asked in relation to this matter.
Professor Hanyane, lovely speaking to you this morning. Thank you so much for your time, and we were speaking to Professor Barry Hanyane.